Hi, my name is Rob Freundlich. I wanted to speak to you today a little bit about external validation and how to apply results to your own practice. I do have some financial relationships to disclose. I don't think any of them are related to the content of this talk, and I'm not going to discuss any off-label or investigational drugs. Here are the overall session learning objectives for today. My talk is going to focus predominantly on the first two learning objectives, whether we can apply single center data to your own clinical practice, and talk a little bit about some of the trade-offs of single center versus multi-center design. So to start things off, I wanted to talk a little bit about how to make the models that we frequently read about in the anesthesiology literature more useful to clinicians. And I think philosophically, there are a few critical points when we're approaching the problem. First, the model has to be something that's clinically useful or something that clinicians are actively worrying about and where having a model is in some way helpful. The models that are proposed for use need to be reasonably accurate. There are some features of accuracy that I think need to all be examined depending on the proposed use case, whether it's the model discrimination, calibration, or net benefit. You really want models that can be easily integrated into clinical workflows so that they're easy to use when people need them. Ideally, the model can suggest some step that a clinician can take that's reasonably easy to take and that can actually be done in a timely manner. And probably most importantly, whatever the model is suggesting needs to be clinically plausible, meaning clinicians are going to believe that those are valid predictors for the outcome that you're trying to predict. And clinicians really need to trust the model. So how do we actually get that desired endpoint of trustworthy models? First and foremost, all of the things that I'm going to talk about and my other panelists are going to talk about today really don't matter if people aren't going to use the models. So I really want to stress that that's the absolute priority, and that should be the goal of this entire process. So if you want people to actually use the models, I'm going to keep harping on this trust concept because I think that this is one of the major barriers in the field. I think if you want to demonstrate that something is worth using, sometimes generalizability and plausibility can really help a lot towards achieving that trust. And I think reproducibility is also a really important part of demonstrating that a model is worth using. External validation really gets at those three bolded points that I make there. So I think that's broadly why people frequently push for external validation of predictive models. So what exactly is external validation? I think it's thrown around a lot. There are, broadly speaking, three types of external validation. I wouldn't say that any one is any inherently better than the other, but they are three very different things. So first, there's temporal external validation, which means you're looking at the same broad patient population. You're just looking at it at a different time period. That can be very useful. You already know that you can access the data. If you've already done the model on that patient population, you've already validated a lot of the covariates in the model. But practice patterns change, and it's a new sample of patients. Obviously, though, there's some very entrenched practice patterns at some institutions, some things that may not change as much. So that may be one limitation to temporal validation. It's also geographical validation, meaning you're looking at a different patient population. So you go to a new institution, but maybe one that's pretty similar to the institution where the model was developed. And finally, there's domain validation, which is just a completely different environment. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. So I wanted to use an example to try to illustrate some of the steps that can be taken when you're trying to do this with predictive modeling. So I want to talk about predicting reintubation after cardiac surgery. That's the paper that my group published last year. So broadly speaking, we wanted to look at cardiac surgery patients. We wanted to look at them after surgery, and we wanted to know what is the risk of reintubation at the moment in time when a provider decides to extubate and pull the breathing tube. So really, given the information that a provider would have at hand when they've decided to extubate, what is that patient's individual risk? We really wanted that model to be useful, some of the philosophical points I touched on earlier. So we wanted to limit things that we looked at to be clinically plausible, meaning things that we felt were reasonable to include. And really importantly, we wanted things that were available in the EHR in routine clinical practice without needing to click any extra buttons or collect any new data elements. So with that as our initial screening criteria, we looked at a little over 3 years of data. We had almost 3,000 patients. Of those patients, 90 were reintubated within 48 hours of initial extubation. So that's a reintubation rate of about 3.2%. Given that event rate of 90, we conservatively estimated that we would have 6 degrees of freedom for modeling, assuming 15 events per degree of freedom. We did, because we looked at what would be routinely available in routine clinical practice, we did find that we had no missing data as we expected. Now, one thing we did next, which I think is somewhat unique, is we tried to actually look at the strength of some of the predictors that we found in our modeling. So here you see an ANOVA plot. So this is just modeling the strength of each predictor. And this is a really nice way to graphically represent some of those tables with odds ratios that you'll frequently see in the anesthesiology literature. So you can see that inotropes as a categorical variable had the strongest strength of prediction. And you'll see over on the right, the odds ratios just highlight that's a very large odds ratio. So 1 inotrope at the time of extubation meant that you were 15 times as likely to get reintubated. 2 or more was 62 times the odds. So really, really large odds ratio there. The other 3 predictors that we included in our model were dexmedetomidine dose and time to extubation. So time from the end of anesthesia to that initial extubation. And finally, respiratory rate at the time of extubation. Our overall model had really nice performance using bootstrapped validation. So we had an AUC of 0.86. I would just highlight that AUC is frequently offered as a means for assessing model performance, but it's just one way of assessing the accuracy of a model. Another way that model accuracy could be assessed would be something like a Breyer score. We also frequently are asked to assess the sensitivity and specificity of a model because the sensitivity and specificity varies. So at differing points on the model, sensitivity and specificity may vary. What's frequently used is called the Uden's cut point. So that's a mathematical cut point that optimizes sensitivity and specificity, but is a nice way to demonstrate the accuracy of your model using positive predictive value, negative predictive value, and other things that readers are often used to reading. Another thing we did that I wanted to highlight is that we looked at how risk varied across the patient population. So not just looking at the odds ratios for the overall population, but actually graphically, how did risk vary for each individual patient, really trying to individualize our thinking about care. So here, first box would be the risk by number of inotropes, followed by risk by varying Precedex dose. I would just highlight, I think the shape of this curve is really informative on the dexmedetomidine dose. So you can see there's a very flat range from 0.2 to 1.5, which are fairly standard dosing ranges for the drug. Which I would say is indicative of the lack of a dose response, meaning the risk may just be that the patient is on dexmedetomidine, not actually that the risk varies by the dose. So it's less likely that the medication itself is causal. Conversely, time to extubation, very linear relationship, which makes sense clinically. The longer someone's been intubated, the more likely that the extubation will not be successful. Followed by respiratory rate. You can see there's a very flat area up until about 25 or 30 breaths per minute, where the rate begins to increase linearly. Makes sense clinically, but it is nice to have that as something we can offer graphically. We also looked at some predictors that are commonly thought of clinically. They did not perform as well. So these really did not contribute meaningfully to the model, but still looking at them graphically is an interesting way to analyze these. Mentioned earlier that there are other facets of accuracy that are worth looking at. We did look at model calibration. Fortunately, most patients are at a relatively low predicted risk. So while the calibration wasn't as good at higher predicted probability, the vast majority of patients were lower predicted probability. So moving on to external validation, we felt that we had a model that performed well, but as we mentioned in our discussion, as authors frequently do, we discussed the lack of external and prospective validation as a limitation, said that this should be a future step. But some broad considerations that we immediately thought of when we started exploring this, the baseline rate may be different. So the actual intercepts for the model may be different, and it's not clear, is it okay to just change the intercepts just for the differing baseline rate? What about changing the coefficients? So what if the odds ratios are a little different at different sites? Can you change the coefficients? What about even changing the predictors? Could you maybe add a new predictor if it helps the model performance at a new site? Finally, should you consider even tuning? So should you add some of the new sites data to your data set and explore how that improves model performance? So at what point does it become a new model when you're doing this external validation? We worked with our collaborators at UCLA to explore this. And right off the bat, we saw that UCLA's reintubation rate was almost half ours, which is going to impact the model calibration and those intercepts. But despite that, keeping the exact same coefficients, model performance was reasonably good at UCLA, 0.68 AUC. Actually going back and changing the coefficients, so keeping the same predictors, but allowing the coefficients to change, actually didn't really improve model performance very much. Only went up to 0.71. Question whether that's a clinically meaningful difference. So as we're exploring next steps, as we're working to refine this data set, one question would be how much retuning or refining is necessary. It may be much easier to share the coefficients. So you can share coefficients because they're not PHI. Sharing raw data and trying to do retuning may have some logistical barriers. Dr. Hofer is going to be speaking about that a little later. I mentioned there are multiple types of validation. This would be an example, I would argue, of geographical external validation. UCLA has a fairly similar practice, looking at more diverse sites and trying to assess domain external validity. It's going to be an important next step. I mentioned earlier that temporal validation is important and will be an important step as we look at our own Vanderbilt data. I think trying to work towards getting clinicians to use the model will be very important, and trying to integrate things into the electronic health record or make things accessible at the point of care is going to be an important step. I'll offer here, the model is readily available as a Shiny app. The link is here in the presentation. Feel free to use it. It is free to use. I think starting to build some clinical decision support tools for clinicians to actually use this model more easily will be important. And then finally, I think what's particularly exciting will be starting to build some multi-center clinical trials, leveraging this data sharing and data collection architecture that we're building as we're doing this modeling to actually improve our clinical performance and give clinicians really some concrete steps that they can take with these data. Thank you very much. Just wanted to acknowledge the VAPOR team, which is the Vanderbilt Anesthesiology and Perioperative Informatics Research Division, my mentors, and the biostatistical team at Avail, as well as my external collaborators on this project. Thank you.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the next part of this talk. For the next few minutes, what I'd like to discuss is federated learning, multi-center results without sharing data. So as you heard from good friend Rob, there are reasons why you want to do things, multi-center and to validate some of your work outside your own center. The challenge there are some challenges with doing that, and federated learning is a way that's gaining some popularity and is a way to address some of those challenges. And I'll share a little bit about what federated learning is and why people think that it may be at least a good solution to some of the problems. Before we start, just a little bit about myself. I'm an associate professor at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. I've been working with EMR data for a little bit more than 15 years now. And I have some funding from the NIH around that area, primarily around machine learning models for perioperative risk prediction. I do have two disclosures. First, I'm the founder and president of a company called Extrical Health that helps hospitals leverage data from their EHRs. And I also have do some consulting, and in the past I've had some funding from Merck. None of that is going to be involved in anything that we're going to talk about today. So when I was in medical school, I used to have a professor, and he used to say at the end of this lecture, you will. So you will know what machine learning equation looks like, which is important for understanding how federated learning works. You'll understand the implications of limited data sets to machine learning from a technical point of view, and then learn how federated learning can provide the benefits of big data without some of the issues associated with data sharing. So let's step back for a second and just talk about, well, what is machine learning and how does it work? So in machine learning, you have some large set of data that you've generally split into a training and testing. In each case, you're going to generate some features from your data. That could be things like preoperative labs, the age of a patient, BMI, what surgery they're having, et cetera. You're going to generate some model, and then that model is going to output a result to predict something of interest. Preoperative mortality, how long a surgery is going to take, postoperative acute kidney injury, whatever you might imagine. And then you're going to have some testing data. And essentially, the concept behind machine learning is that you're going to be able to create a model good enough on the data you have that it can work well on data it has never seen before. So when you think about kind of traditional statistics that are frequently reported in journals, let's say 15, 20 years ago, right? You did a logistic regression or some kind of model on data and reported how it performed on that model. On machine learning model, the key is that you want it predicted on data that the model has never seen before, right? So what does it look like? Well, the equation you're going to generate in some way, shape, or form is usually some version of this. Y being what you want to predict, X being each of the features, so it could be BMI, type of surgery, patient age, pre-op creatinine, et cetera. And then the A's here represent some coefficients that the model is going to learn to modify the features. Now, there are lots of different versions of this, but this is generally how it's going to work, right? So if you have two data points, right, it's very easy to then generate a model that's going to perfectly predict the data points, right? Now, as you start adding more and more data points, as we all know, the model is going to fit it, as best as it can, right? The model could be a straight line, it could be a curve, et cetera. For the purposes here, I want to keep it nice and simple, right? However, the ability of the model to work well on future data and how well it performs is really based upon some relationship between the number of data points you have and the features that you're going to do. So you sort of can have three options, right? On the left here, you have a model that's underfitted, right? So for whatever reason, you don't have enough features and the data points or whatever is working, your model doesn't perform particularly well, right? In the middle, you have a model that performs well, it's well fit, right? And roughly tracks the data. But you can also have something called overfitting, right? Where you have too many features relative to the number of data points you have. And this model really doesn't make any sense, right? Because if you were to extrapolate some point in the middle, right, it's not going to work on this zigzag, right? And this is really why you need big data to generate these models, right? So the size of the data that you need is really proportional to the number of features you have. The more features you want to include the data, the more data points from the EHR, the more observations you're going to need for this model to work well. So one limitation of single center data sets, right, is simply that you don't have enough data points, right? The other question has to do with something called generalizability, right? So we've said here you have training and testing data, but your model is only as good as the observations that it's seen. So if you train a model, as Rob showed, on Vanderbilt's data, right, it may or may not perform well on data from UCLA or the University of Miami, or a third world country, for argument's sake, right? So you sort of have to assume that the data that you're training the model on is somehow representative of the other observations that are going to be seen. And one of the limitations, right, of a single center data is simply that it's not generalizable, that you don't really know how it's going to perform on some of those other data points, right? So generalizability is essentially going to assume that the training and the actual data are somehow similar, right? Now, if you look at a lot of the machine learning models that have been out here, and this is just a smattering of ones that, I've pulled off, but there are literally probably dozens and dozens, if not hundreds at this point, of machine learning models to predict perioperative outcomes, let alone, broader medical outcomes. By and large, most of these papers right now are about 50 to 100 features in several thousand patients. So the number of patients is a few orders of magnitude greater than the number of features. But as you can imagine from the EHR, we really have far, far more features than that, right? Think about bringing in all the waveform data, all the labs that a patient has, all the medications that a patient's on. It's not hard to imagine models. And if you start to think about, relationships between those things, ratios of labs, it's not hard to imagine models that are hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands or even millions of features. And that starts to become a potential issue for overfitting, right? You also, all of these papers are really written on, for the most part, single center data, right? They're not externally validated because some of the challenges of doing that. So we don't know how well this model over here from the Journal of Clinical Medicine is going to perform on a bunch of patients that is, in another institution. It's unknown. So single center data sets are limited by overfitting, right? Because of the size of the data, and generalizability. Let's talk for a couple of minutes about how federated learning can potentially help solve that problem. So what is federated learning? Federated learning, here you have one hospital in the middle that's going to create the model, right? And all these other 3 hospitals where potentially you want to partner together to share the data. Okay, well, let's talk about how machine learning works for a second. Okay, you have your knowns, right, which are the features that come in. And then it's going to, basically what the model is going to do is it's going to make an educated guess at all of what they call the hyperparameters it wants to do, evaluate the guesses, tweak them a little bit and see if it performs better and better. And you iterate on that over and over and over again until you get the perfect model, okay? Now, in traditional multi-site machine learning, right, you solve overfitting and generalizability, but you lack data privacy, because what happens is each of these other hospitals is going to take all of their data and send it up here. The problem with that is data security is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Healthcare is one of the top 2 targets for cybersecurity attacks right now. Many hospitals themselves are reluctant to release copies of their data. There are issues in terms of IRB approvals, data privacy, data loss. That's kind of beyond the scope. But for a number of reasons, people don't necessarily want to make multiple copies of all of the data, right? In machine learning, what you're going to do is each hospital, each of the sites will train the model on there. And instead of sending the data back, they're going to send the coefficients that then get combined here and then returned back for these new coefficients that they again train on their data. So instead of exchanging data, all the hospitals are doing now is exchanging these coefficients, which are not protected, right? There's no danger of that getting lost. There's no risk in private. So what you do is, right, you obviate the needs for data privacy or the issues with data privacy, but you get the benefits of larger data sets and more generalizability, right? Now, in practice, there are some good things and some bad things. As I said, you don't have to transfer the data, right? Logistically, that may be easier. From a security privacy point of view, it's better. But all the sites need to have the data in exactly the same format, right? So if you go back a slide, right, all of the features here need to be exactly the same, right? They can't be different. So each site needs to have the technical expertise in order to generate the data in the same format. And they also need to have the infrastructure to train the models, right? As we know, machine learning models require large processors, or they're done in the cloud, they're done on an on-site server rack, but whatever it is, they need to have the technical infrastructure to do it. So you trade the benefits of data privacy. However, each institution needs to have a certain degree of technical sophistication in order to make it work, right? However, because a lot of the joint research groups that are going on right now are places where people tend to have that technical infrastructure, federated learning is seen as a way to get a lot of the benefits of multi-site data without some of the dangers around data privacy and data transfers. So thank you very much, and look forward to your questions at the end.
Hi, my name is Amy Shanks, and I'm currently the Director of Analytics and Insights at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. And I'm here to talk to you about multi-center modeling and quality improvement using the different types of data to gain a better perspective. As a disclosure, I currently work for Blue Cross, but I'm not presenting on behalf of the company. My talk will be focused on the fourth learning objective, which is to analyze the methodology of retrospective and comparative studies to determine if results can be applied to diverse patient populations. Multi-center modeling has increased in popularity with the increase in CQIs and registries. The main goal of multi-center modeling, therefore, is to improve outcomes, decrease variation in treatment patterns, and lower total cost of care. This then leads to identification of variability in treatment patterns, identification of high and low hospitals and/or providers, identification of regional impact, and determination of appropriate care. To achieve positive results with modeling, collaboration across key stakeholders is needed. And these key stakeholders would therefore be clinicians, payors, and quality champions to help drive positive changes to the healthcare system. This includes appropriate large-scale representation across all different patient types. You need to consider if the patient mix is similar between different hospitals that are being represented. Is it just urban versus rural? Is it trauma centers or not? Is it just a key representative sample for the type of data that you want to model? Obviously, EHR integration between hospitals is key, with structured data elements and accuracy checks that are built in there to ensure that there's no free text elements that are being pulled. Complete data for risk adjustment is also needed. This would include patient comorbidities, outcomes, payer data. And then it's also imperative that you have structure and process measures to identify performance. This is traditionally done from a CQI perspective. To build the appropriate models, understanding the usability of different data sources is key. Using payer data will allow providers to assess quality measured against their peers to drive enhanced decision-making and lower the overall total cost of care. Also, it allows you to understand the utilization and spend patterns and predict future spend and utilization. Given the audience, many of you may not have experience with payer data. Payer data's pros is that it can be used to assess the episode of care for the cost of care, 90-day, 30-day, whatever episode quantity that would be used. It also can track use and utilization. It has the ability to target providers by differentiation between high and low cost providers. This is being used in some value-based reimbursement modeling currently. We can track pharmacy spend and quantify medication adherence, and then also population health management to help by decision-making to hopefully help eliminate healthcare disparities. Cons of payer data, though, is that you cannot adequately identify the severity of a patient's illness. There is no patient outcomes, lack of full demographic data, sparse laboratory data, and then there is no biometric data available. I think the audience is all very familiar with the other data sources that would be needed in multi-center modeling, such as the clinical data, which has your patient comorbidities, your severity of illness, the laboratory data, complications, outcomes, and the provider providing the care. Registry data, such as the structured data elements, health status of patients, and focused outcomes. And then there's other sources, such as CMS data sources and the American Hospital Association to determine the size of the hospital and the type of services the hospital has. Data integration then leads to appropriate modeling techniques. Across the board, multi-center modeling techniques can fall within a couple of high-level assumptions. First, you adequately need to adjust for random and nested effects. Do you need to adjust for the providers nested in the hospitals, or do you just need to adjust for the hospitals in itself? What level of granularity is actually needed? Second, we all know that prospective randomized trials are the gold standard. However, with this multi-center modeling, it's imperative to adjust for selection bias. This can be done by either propensity score matching, covariate adjustment, or weighting. Third, GEE is commonly used. Difference in difference methods are very common to compare the pre-post period with different adjustment techniques for cases and controls. And then regression modeling is also used with observed to expected adjustments included. These adjustments can be included to look between hospitals or across patients' comorbidities as well. All of these techniques can be used together to achieve the best modeling results. An example for implementation of the appropriate methods is to look at the variation in the 90-day episode costs and cabbages. For this talk, I'm going to focus on the methods behind this paper. The payor data was used from 87 hospitals and 37 physician organizations to calculate the 90-day episode payments. Clinical data was collected via the cardiac surgeon CQI, which also feeds into the Society of Thoracic Surgeons registry data, the STS. And then the hospital characteristics were abstracted from the American Hospital Association. Risk-adjusted complication rates and costs were created to identify low and high value hospitals. So the clinical risk adjustment used the observed to expected ratios by dividing the patient level complication rates by the expected rates from STS themselves. Then the risk adjusted mean complication rate was the ODE ratio for each hospital multiplied by the unadjusted complication rate. This identified hospitals as low or high value based on cost and complication rates. Cost was predicted using a two-step approach. First, they adjusted for patient comorbidities and payment 6 months prior to the index cabbage procedure using an ODE ratio approach. And then that fed into a GEE model where they clustered around hospital to predict cost. This resulted in the categorized hospitals by value and defining the intersection between complications and spending. You can see in the lower left-hand side that you have high-value hospitals, which have lower spend and lower complication rates, while on the right-hand side, you have low-value hospitals, which has high spending and high complication rates. What they found was that for low-value hospitals, they had higher readmissions and higher professional post-acute care and index payments, which can be seen on the left-hand side of your screen. Sensitivity analysis showed comparable costs for patients without complications or readmissions. This data then shows an opportunity for collaboration for lower value hospitals to learn from the higher value hospitals. Using a version of these methods with appropriate data integration and the use of data can lead to answering many different research hypotheses, such as population adjusted analysis adjusting for comorbidities and costs, risk-adjusted episode of care, evaluation of P for P with proper patient and cost adjustments, provider treatment and or outcome variation across hospitals, risk-adjusted differences in spend and utilization, analyses to compare fee-for-service versus value-based payment structures. To this point, the methods described are standard for multi-center modeling around predicting outcome costs using clinical and payer data. However, collaboration can also drive enhancement of the quality of the healthcare. By identifying and adopting best practices, to driving trends for national guidelines, lowering complication rates, increasing overall cost, and to guide decision-making. Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan has had the development of the CQIs over the past 20 years and supported this effort. Currently, there are 17 CQIs, over 130 Michigan hospitals participating. This is nationally recognized and has been presented across 25 countries in 5 continents. And it's also a template for other Blues plans. So urology in Pennsylvania has been reached out to, and then general surgery for South Carolina and Illinois. They are driving change with approximately 250 peer-reviewed publications in the last 4 years. And this is a proven success that the integration between clinical and payer data can enhance quality. CQIs have also had success in cost avoidance over the past 7 years, which has showed $413 million in Blue Cross healthcare cost avoidance and $1.4 billion in statewide healthcare cost avoidance. So driving quality changes has a positive impact. Spire, the anesthesia CQI in the state of Michigan and the quality arm of MPOG, has documented success in changing provider behavior. In 2015, Spire published 2 transfusion measures, one to check hemoglobin or hematocrit levels before and after transfusion, and 2, the assessment of overtransfusion. The compliance has increased in a positive trajectory over time. Surgeons have also made significant improvements in changing practices. IVC filters had significant complication rates. In 2008, the CQI implemented a measure to decrease the use of IVC filters. Within 1 year, they found a 90% decrease, which traditionally would have taken 15 years using translational research. Orthopedic surgeon CQI also identified high variability in SNF use after joint replacements with no improvement in outcome. The initiative to decrease discharges to SNF was followed by rapid decrease in overall utilization and also the decreased spend. CQI infrastructure within the state of Michigan led to the ability to quickly respond to the pandemic. They were able to assemble the appropriate resources and experts to be able to have rapid dissemination of policy changes and key information to help drive change. One such example was early in the pandemic, 56.6% of hospital patients with COVID-19 received antibiotic therapy within the first 2 days of hospitalization, and this was due to fear of a bacterial infection. Testing actually revealed that 96% of those patients only had COVID-19, proving inappropriate antibiotic use. This was disseminated and published and helped drive change for the appropriate treatment early on in the pandemic. Using appropriate data integration and statistical methodology can adequately model many different research hypotheses amongst diverse patient populations. Enhancing quality through CQIs drives reduction in poor outcomes and lowering overall total cost of care. I'd like to thank you for your time.
We might as well start. My name is Rich Epstein. I'm a professor of clinical anesthesiology at the University of Miami and the director of the department's division of perioperative analytics. Thank you all for attending our session this afternoon. We originally had 4 talks and we dropped mine because we wanted to give each of the speakers enough time to make their presentations. I did upload my talk to the file section, so if you do want to see what I was going to say, it's up there in the file. You can download it. As a reminder, our panelists are Robert Freundlich, who's the associate professor of anesthesiology at Vanderbilt and the chief of their informatics research division. Ira Hofer recently has returned to Mount Sinai from UCLA, where he is an assistant professor of anesthesiology in departments of anesthesiology and also medicine. And Amy Shanks, who just spoke, is the acting director of analytics at Blue Cross Blue Shield, and previously was at the University of Michigan as a PhD data scientist in the medical school, and published a lot of papers in her tenure there. John Wanderer from Vanderbilt had a question during the chat, and if he wants to ask that in person, I figure he can unmute and do that.
Sure. I was just wondering, Rob, if you wouldn't mind talking a bit further about sort of the very large effect size that you saw with the 2 inotropes for reintubation. I was curious if that was something that you also saw at UCLA, and if so, if that was what you might consider sort of low-hanging fruit from a CDS perspective.
Yeah, thanks, John. So it's interesting you bring this up. So the initial model that we ran, just to recap for people who may have missed the beginning of the presentation, was just running the exact same coefficients on the UCLA model, not changing things at all. That had an AUC of 0.68. We reran the model, generating new coefficients at UCLA, and got it up to 0.71. But what I didn't discuss was when we actually lifted up the hood and looked at the coefficients, they were completely different. So I have everything here as a coefficient. So I was doing some log calculations kind of on the fly. But their largest predictor was actually dexmedetomidine dose when we redid the coefficients using their data. So the odds ratio for that was 11.5, whereas the inotropes were quite a bit less contributory, more on the order of like 2.5 to 3 odds ratios. So I think it's an interesting point when you're starting to do this sort of validation. One of the questions I raised, and I don't know that there is a clear definitive answer, you certainly can take the same coefficients and run them somewhere else, or if you change the coefficients, I was surprised at how much the coefficients changed and in what magnitude without actually impacting the overall performance of the model. So I think it does raise some interesting questions when we're starting to think about interventions and clinical decision support, whether it makes sense to focus on just part of the phenomena that we're modeling, or whether we need to look at all of the different things that we've modeled.
I would just jump in and add, I mean, I think there are 2 interesting questions in my mind. Number one is, I think that, as you have these multi-center data sets, it opens up interesting opportunities to look at practice pattern variation and how that influences care, right? So I think there are 2 possibilities, right? One, people in LA and in Tennessee are different, right? Their physiology is different. I think that's probably pretty unlikely. I'm going to bet humans are humans by and large. It's my guess. More likely, right, is that we all know institutions have a way of doing things, right? And Vanderbilt has a way of managing their post-cardiac surgical patients, and UCLA has their way, and Miami has their way, et cetera, right? And there's definitely a lot of institutional culture, right? And I think these larger data sets may start to give an opportunity for us to compare, the culture and the way things are done at one place versus another, and find some kind of best practices that might be overarching. There are lots of steps, but I definitely think that's one thing. The other thing I think is there's a big step, and I think, John, you and I wrote a paper on this a few years ago, if I remember right, but between models that you publish in journals and then what you do in the real world, right? And there's definitely a balance between getting the best AUC or precision or sensitivity or whatever your metric is, and then what's operationalizable. And then maybe you can get most of the bang from your buck with something that's much simpler to implement, right? Depending on what those coefficients are. So it might be, all the infrastructure necessary to build this model into, clinical care at Vanderbilt might be kind of complicated, but doing a quick CDS rule on 2 inotropes at Vanderbilt may be pretty easy, right? So there's definitely a balance you have to strike there between the statistical best and then feasibility in the real world. And sometimes I call that the difference between physics and engineering, right? Physics is what works in a paper. Engineering is what makes rockets actually, take off and land on the moon.
Yeah, I can say we ran the coefficients also at Miami, and our area of the curve wasn't quite as good. It was 0.64. I went ahead and tuned the model using our own numbers, and got it up to about 0.72, which is kind of very similar to what they had at UCLA. When I reran the model and looked to see which of the various variables stayed in the model, it was only the time of intubation. Now, I mean, we have a very different practice at Miami. I mean, our surgeon does almost everything through these little keyhole incisions, including like aortic root replacements. We rarely do thoracotomies or median sternotomies. You know, we don't do heart transplant. So it's a different group of patients, but you know, so, you know, it's, you know, I think there really are issues in terms of just kind of blindly applying these models. And that kind of raises a question that I was going to ask to Rob. And that's the question of like, what kind of an assessment do you think a hospital or a group needs to do before they apply some prediction model that's been, you know, published on the internet, maybe, you know, available in a very nice, convenient manner as like just a shiny app, which you can just, you know, log into on any web browser and put in a few numbers and it gives you back a prediction. So what do you think hospitals should be doing before they adopt these things?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Rich. So I think it's important. We talked a lot about the 3 types of external validation. I think most people, when they talk about external validation, are describing geographical external validation. I would argue, though, probably the domain external validation is going to be the most important when you're trying to achieve trust, and specifically making sure that the models apply in a domain that's similar to the hospital that's seeking to adopt the findings from the predictive model. So ideally, you can be comfortable that the model has been tested in a very similar environment, similar cohort of patients, and that was still generating trustworthy findings. And as to, you know, exactly what one person values versus another, that may be a little bit beyond the scope of what we can achieve, but at least trying to feel comfortable that similar patients were reasonably easy to predict using the model would help a lot.
I mean, do you think the hospitals need to repeat the study, you know, which certainly can present challenges, or do you think if the calibration is reasonable, at least in terms of like the intercept, that might be enough if the patients are similar enough?
Yeah, you know, I think we showed calibration, for example. Some other things could be drastically different based on differing rates of the event at the different sites. I would argue that calibration probably doesn't matter as much when you're a clinician and you're just trying to figure out who's high risk and who's low risk. So I think when you're thinking about adopting this at your hospital, hopefully that baseline rate probably actually doesn't matter as much. As to whether you should redo the model entirely, I guess I would say it depends how many covariates go into the model, how complicated it would be, you know, what sort of an environment you're working in. I know the 3 of us who've been working on this are working at centers where it's relatively simple to do that. And that's why we've done this. We have easy access to the data. We can pull the covariates pretty quickly, and we built a simple model. That may not be true for many of the models you're thinking of adopting. It would be prohibitively difficult. So I think instead focusing more on applicability to your patients and trying to gain that trust is going to be more important.
It's David Polliner from Seattle. I just wanted to comment on something from that Ira said in terms of variability. We in the Pediatric Regional Anesthesia Network, we published 2 papers on practice variability. It was a large data set. It was about 110,000 patients in the data set. We found a huge amount of variability, and there was variability both from center to center and within each center. We're looking at dosing in different regional blocks in kids. And one of the things that proves to be extremely difficult is that if you don't have the database set up in a way to look at the reasons behind that variability from the first place, you really can't sort out why these things are happening. Are they due to actual clinical reasons, or just dogma, or mandates from individual departments at individual centers? There's a huge amount of variability that's unexplained. And we believe that a lot of what we saw was actually unwanted variability that was based on non-scientific and non-clinical bases. But unless you set up the database to look for the reasons for those things, you'll have a really hard time figuring it out. And you have to go ahead and do a second prospective study to figure it.
Great. So I have a question for Amy. So do you think that Michigan is unusual in terms of the level of cooperation between like the academic medical center, UM, and the Blues and other insurance carriers there, or is this model of, I mean, how does this model of cooperation between like the payors and the hospitals get advanced further? Because, you know, I imagine, you know, you're looking at very different data, and some of the granularity you kind of alluded to sometimes isn't there. You know, what's going on in the world, and what are your sort of recommendations in terms of how to foster some of these collaborations?
Yeah, so I think Michigan is definitely unique, right? Because Blue Cross puts so much money into housing these CQIs and running them and keeps on collaborating with them. So there's 2 more in the works, you know, so essentially at Blue Cross, they look for those really high spending type of comorbidities, like diabetes is one that they're thinking about, you know, launching a CQI around too. And then once, you know, those thresholds above 90% are reached, then they turn those CQIs off. So other Blues plans have been reaching out to see if they could leverage that sort of technology and between the payer and the hospital systems. I think Michigan also, because Blue Cross is so prominent across the whole state of Michigan, that, you know, that puts us at a better advantage as well, that we have a lot of our providers in here. However, you know, as you know, that things are switching from fee for service to more risk-based contracts, and I think a lot of payers are probably going to go down that route. So for the hospital system themselves, for the providers themselves, to ensure that they keep on getting, you know, adequate payments to keep the system hospital alive, right, and functioning, there's going to need to be more collaboration. So I think switching from fee for service to the risk-based contracts, you know, different P for P, different value-based reimbursements, that's going to kind of force these relationships, you know, outside of the state of Michigan as well.
And are these relationships set up so that, like, let's say a hospital participates, like if they exceed the metric, they get paid more, if they drop below, they get less? Is it like sort of that kind of, you know, performance model? Is that the way it works?
Sure, there's a bunch that are built in there. So there's P for P that are built in the CQIs, and then we also just have other programs that are at a physician organization level, where then they do get, you know, extra reimbursement if basically, you know, they do those O to E ratios for all the different ones to see if you are above or below the mean. And when you are in those risk-based contracts, if you're below it, then you end up having to pay Blue Cross, where if you're above it, then we end up paying you. So it drives change that way as well. And they do have access to, you know, different type of dashboards that you guys are used to seeing through MPOG and through Aspire, right? Similar dashboards, but just specific for that type of specialty.
Did any of the other participants have another question? Because I have one more for Ira if no one else has anything they want to ask. So Ira, could you just discuss briefly, like, you know, is there a role for this, you know, kind of federated model, you know, among hospitals that have like different EHRs? So the place that has Cerner, the place that has Epic, as far as like creating sort of a common database that either could feed and then have the benefits of being able to do collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are opportunities, right? I mean, Rich, that's like similar to the data model that we built at UCLA, and you guys did it, you know, Sinai. In theory, I think a lot of those, you know, those structures could be like a labs table could be populated out of Cerner, you know, and we've actually played with doing it, for example, like using the mimic data set and things like that. So I think there are, I mean, I think one of the challenges is still data interoperability is not really there. You know, even between 2 implementations of the same EHR, let alone different ones. There's supposed to be new federal standards coming out, right, around, you know, primarily I think going to be based around fire in the next few months. We'll see how much that really solves that problem or not. But I mean, I think there are ways to do it. It requires some plumbing, but, you know, lab results are lab results, blood pressures are blood pressures, right? I mean, So in theory, you should be able to put, I mean, look at the features in Rob's model. I mean, I would hope out of any EHR, if you have someone who's competent, they can figure out how many anatropes a patient's on, before extubation, right? I mean, that shouldn't be, in theory, complicated. In practice, I mean, that was like that temperature paper I think you and I did a few years ago, right? Looking at like temperatures post-op, and you need someone who knows how to clean data, but that should be achievable.
And yeah, and that's a process that John and I did a number of times for studies between when I was at Jefferson and Vanderbilt. Even though we were on completely different databases, we just passed the SQL code back and forth in a data table, and it was, I mean, I think it was quite easy for the most part to get the data back and add another institution to a study to improve the kind of reliability of the results, and help get the study get it published.
Yeah, and I would say, like, I mean, looking at Rob's study as a template again, right? Like the none of us used Rob's code in terms of getting data out of Epic, right? I mean, I think both of us decided to, pull it our own way. And when there were some, data definition questions and things like that, we battled them back and forth, but it wasn't like, everything was interoperable. I don't think it was a huge lift there. As things get more complicated, hopefully there'll be more interoperable things there. But in theory, it should work.
And I guess the final question for the panelists is, what role do you see in terms of the cloud, in terms of helping this sort of collaboration among hospitals, or do you think the individual hospitals are just so tied into their their nervousness about the data that they want to keep it on site? Now, I mean, Mount Sinai has a new initiative to move everything to the cloud in the next, I don't know how many years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever the time frame will be. But what do you think about as sort of a generalized model for like where health IT is going in terms of improving quality?
I guess I can jump. Oh, go ahead, Rob.
Vanderbilt's doing pretty similar thing with moving to the cloud, and I think at least within the institution, it's intended to facilitate things. But Rich, looking at a lot of the questions you put in the polls and looking at the results, certainly seems like a lot of institutions are presenting hurdles to doing this sort of data sharing that's not going to be immediately addressed through the cloud. And I know Ira talked a lot about that in his talk. But I wonder a little bit if we need to get past some of those concerns around risk and how to do this safely if we're going to effectively leverage the cloud.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the culture inside most of the institutions now is data, very focused on data privacy and security, right? And from a cybersecurity point of view, healthcare is like one of the top industries of concern, right? And targets for cyber criminals. So that environment certainly doesn't help companies wanting to move to the cloud. I don't think the cloud is really any safer or less safe than on-premise, to be perfectly honest. I mean, most of the clouds we're talking about, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, I mean, they can do state-of-the-art security, and I would argue that, probably they'll be able to keep up to date with, state-of-the-art security better than individual health systems do. But it's like, it's like a autopilot in a Tesla, right? Like no one's going to get into a car without a steering wheel just because like people have that comfort and want to be able to grab the wheel when they need to, right? And I think that's the thing. Eventually, slowly but surely, things will move to the cloud. There are a lot of things. There's a lot of data ownership questions that are going to have to get resolved. There's a lot of, technical things that have to get resolved. I mean, I think there are lots of things. They will slowly but surely. My bet is probably first in some smaller consortiums, 2 hospitals, let's say Vanderbilt and Mount Sinai, not that I know of any plans between either of those institutions, but just because they're on the call, or Vanderbilt and Michigan or whatever, right? Like, 2 groups get together and say, let's build this consortium, they iron it out, and then those consortiums go, kind of like what happened with MPOG. So I think it'll happen. It's just probably going to take years.
And I think I'll add in from a payer perspective that, each health system has their own contracts with what we pay out, right? And that is another thing that we, you don't want to give us PHI and we don't want to give you that, because the health system then can use that to leverage better contracting rates as well. So there's a lot to work out for key collaboration.
All right, I think we're a few minutes over. I mean, I think we could stay on for another couple before they boot us off. Does anyone else have any kind of concluding thoughts or comments that they want to make? No? Okay, well, again, thank you all for attending the session. And so I think, all of us will be more than happy to field, any questions that you have, like after the fact. I think our contact information is available somewhere on the meeting website. And hopefully have the rest of the weekend. And hopefully we'll see you next year in Colorado. Is that what I'm told? Yes, I think so, Colorado.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.